Program Support for the El Dorado County and Charter SELPAs. And we're going to give people a little bit more time, maybe a minute or two, to log in, and then we will come back and start the webinar. Everyone, thank you for joining us. You are logged into the Supporting Inclusive Practices webinar series part 1, Envisioning. And we have about 10, 12 people joining currently. So we'll give you about another minute or two, and then we will get started about 1:03. Well, it is officially 1:03, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Kevin Schaefer, Director of Program Support, and we also have with us Kristen Brooks, Executive Director, and Dr. Sima Cuddy, Director of the Supporting Inclusive Practices project. So we are so glad that everyone was able to join today. Just a couple reminders before we officially get started, that although your camera and your microphone are on mute, we would like for this to be a participatory webinar. So the chat is open so that you can ask questions, you can communicate to each other, and then we also have a number of questions that we would like to ask you and have you respond to in that chat box. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded and will be archived for further review in the future. And we would also hope that throughout the webinar, as you ask questions, we can respond as quickly as possible. There will be points at which we will need to move forward just a bit. So if there are any questions that are asked in the chat that we don't get to, we will review and we will respond to all to make sure that everyone's questions get answered in the very near future. As I said, I'm Kevin Schaefer, and I have a confession to make before we get started. I'm currently visiting my family in Belleville, Illinois, so it's a little bit strange that I'm doing this webinar in the bedroom that I grew up in. So if my elderly mother walks behind me or a cousin runs through the background, please just ignore them. So I just appreciate that and wanted to make that known before we get started. So we appreciate you all being here. So here we go. So for today's, I'm just trying to advance the slide. Sima, can you advance?
Yes.
Thank you. So for today, we are going to focus on the SIP, the Supporting Inclusive Practices Blueprint, that Kristen, Sima, and I spent much of the summer developing as a foundation for the work that we're doing in increasing inclusive practices across the state, specifically with our exemplar sites and our grantees. And the reason that we're spending so much time in our webinar series on the blueprint is that we want the participation in the SIP project not just to be a one and done process, but we would like for the participants to actually see the implementation of inclusive practices as a long-term process, a long-term commitment that is constantly improving across time. And I think as we get into the blueprint a little bit more, you'll see that it is a change process, and we'll focus each webinar on a different stage within the blueprint. This first webinar is focusing on the first stage, which is envisioning. And we're looking closely at the components of envisioning, which include cohesive leadership, vision, mission, values, communicating clarity, creating urgency of purpose, and persuasion of and early adopters. We'll focus on the critical importance of each of these components of the envisioning stage. And I have to say that in my experience in working with districts across California, that when we look at change theory, change processes, it's the envisioning and the building stages that are often forgotten, and they move right into implementation without ensuring that the structures, that the culture is created and set for the enabling environment to actually promote the inclusive practices that we're hoping to implement. And then we will conclude the webinar today with next steps. And please pay attention to the next steps because we've added a number of events that you're able to participate in the upcoming year, as well as reminders. And then we don't want to forget that the survey will be linked at the very end, and we look forward to your feedback for future improvement of our webinar series. So let's jump in. We look at the blueprint specifically in stages that build upon one another. The blueprint, beginning with envisioning, where we're focused today, is really the ideation phase, where the leadership team is not only cohesive, but they have a clear and deep understanding, a shared understanding of what it is that we're setting out to do. We'll focus today on the envisioning, and then we'll move forward into how we build those structures. What are the data collection systems? What's the root cause analysis process? Before we move into the actual implementation of the inclusive practices that we've determined appropriate based on the data that we've collected. From the implementation stage, how do we scale that up across our organization? And then how do we share our learnings with other LEAs in the state so that we can actually scale up beyond just the organization, but into LEAs across the state to ensure that California is one of the states that's at the forefront of inclusive practices that allow for access and equity across all student groups. I want to call particular attention to the very bottom of the blueprint, where it mentions the progress monitoring and the continuous improvement. This is not a linear sequential process. When we get into continuous improvement, we're always looking at the Plan, Do, Study, Act continuous improvement cycles, always looking at the data and adjusting or adapting or abandoning what we're doing so that we're always headed in one linear direction. However, we may need to go back a stage, we may need to go forward a stage, but it's always that narrow, focused attention on where we currently are, what data are we collecting, and how are we utilizing that data to make improvements for all students. And we also wanted to make sure that you understood the why of the blueprint. Many times when we make the leap of change, we miss the mark. And we miss the mark because we don't follow through with the entire implementation process. from looking at what are the innovations that we want to implement. Why do we think that will be the innovation that will move us forward through the inclusion process? Who's on our team? Do we have the structures and the supports available for those that are actually going to receive or use that innovation? So in short, what we're hoping to translate through this process is that we want to create an enabling environment for those that will use the innovation, meaning the teachers, meaning the students, meaning the parents, that if we don't create that enabling environment in which the innovation will be implemented, then everything is for naught. And that's when the pendulum of educational innovations swings. So the SIP blueprint, a really simple definition, focuses on building that capacity across the organization that transforms the organization from an organization that is not allowing access and equity for all students to an organization that is inclusive. So looking at inclusion as a process, using the blueprint, when we go through the stages of the inclusion blueprint, we're really looking at moving forward from a current state of what is to a future state or an imagined state of inclusive practices that lead us from the envisioning stage through the pay it forward stage. And again, that's the process that we'll use for each of our upcoming webinars to take you through each of the stages to move from where we are to where we would like to be in the future. The basic essential elements of inclusion, we have to, across the organization, we have to ensure that everyone understands that the change to inclusive practices is not a narrow or singular event. It's a comprehensive organizational change that focuses on the policy and the practice, foundationed by the culture of inclusion. That if we don't understand culture-wide across the organization that all students deserve a high-quality education in the general education setting as much as possible, then we are doing the work for naught. The fourth piece of the essential elements of inclusion is that there's a cohesive shared leadership team that is communicating the message of inclusion across the culture. And when we look at a cohesive shared leadership team, we're always looking at all levels of the system, and we're looking at an aligned message that goes out across the organization so that we have that culture of inclusion, that everyone understands the message, the vision, and the mission of inclusive education for all students. And we love the quote by Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. In so many cases, we have the best, most researched strategy, and we put that into the classroom without priming the culture of the organization. And in doing so, we have short-term advances, short-term progression that usually cycles back to pretty quickly doing something new and something different again and again, which across the organization creates frustration. So again, we are focusing this webinar on the envisioning stage. Kristen and Sima will focus very deeply on the components of the envisioning stage of cohesive leadership, vision, mission, and values, communicating clarity and urgency of purpose, and persuasion and first adopters. We'll go deeply into these components so that you understand the envisioning piece, the importance of the envisioning piece. And again, this is the piece that in many cases is not developed or culled across the leadership team. So that's why we're focusing very deeply on these first two stages. So why is envisioning important? It's actually more than just important, but it's foundational to the change process. And when we look at the change process, we focus on the team that's making decisions and whether or not that team actually has the knowledge, the experience, the expertise, and basically if they understand the change that we're trying to make across the system, which cannot be made unless we have the input of the users. In doing that, when we look at root cause, what we'll find is doing empathy interviews and understand how the users are experiencing the current innovation. Then we'll truly understand the depth to which the team needs to make the change across the organization. This is what, when we look at envisioning, this is what coalesces, it unites, it activates, and it elevates the team. And not just the leadership team, but teams across the organization at all levels, so that the dissemination of the idea is shared and disseminated in such a way that all factors within the organization, all groups within the organization understand the message, understand their role within that new innovation, and they are trained and coached, and fidelity measures are put in place such that we can ensure that the change is being implemented as intended. I guess this is the doe a deer slide. Let's start at the very beginning. It took me a little while to figure out this, the purpose of that slide, but when I watched the movie again, I understood the point. So we have a question for you. And the question is, and we'd like for you to answer in the chat box, what do you believe the term coherence in cohesive leadership stands for? And we'd like you to answer A, B, C, D, or E. A, balance in all aspects. B, shared depth of understanding regarding purpose. C, symmetry. D, alignment in action. Or E, it's a type of cough. Coherence. So if you would answer in the chat box. We have a B from Richard, a B from Cassie. Look at all those B's. Looks like overwhelmingly we have B. B is the correct answer based on the Fullen definition. The shared depth of understanding about the purpose and nature of the work is the meaning of coherence. A shift in shared state mindset, not alignment. So when we look at coherence, we're looking at a depth of understanding, not just by the leadership team, but how they communicate that information across the organization to ensure that everyone is, for lack of a better term, on the same page. And what do we mean by leadership? A quick quote by Mary Parker Follett. Leadership is not defined by exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those led. The most essential work of the leader is to create more leaders. And when we look at this across an educational system, in many cases, the leader is the superintendent or directors at the district level. What we are promoting through the SIP project is looking at different levels of the organization to ensure that we have teacher leaders, we have parent leaders, we have para-educator leaders, we have administrator leaders, general ed administrators, special education administrators, so that we understand the issues that could lead to a lack of inclusive processes. So when we look at leadership, we're not just saying we're focusing on administration or administrative leadership, but cohesive shared leadership across the organization. And finally, shared leadership brings ownership, and ownership brings a lasting commitment to continuous improvement on the part of those who work day in and day out, teaching the students in classrooms of your school. So often we have the idea that inclusion is done to or given to teachers. And when we look at an innovation such as co-teaching, we can't just put two teachers in a classroom and call it good. The SIP blueprint is looking at the true meaning of inclusion and what structures need to be put in place based on the vision that is set by a leadership team that includes team members that are representative of those that will experience that innovation. So cohesive leadership being the first component of the envisioning process or the envisioning stage within the blueprint is the critical component that needs to be put in place to then begin talking about the vision and the mission and the values of the organization as it relates to inclusive practices. But also beyond inclusive practices, this idea of the blueprint being a process over time works for any innovation that you might be looking forward to implementing. And the advantages of the distributed or shared leadership is the buy-in across the system, which is critical and necessary for inclusive practices to be effective and implemented with fidelity. You get diverse perspectives and expertise by a shared leadership team that is representative of all levels. The safeguards against risk of turnover when people are connected with the passion and the understanding of why we do what we do. Turnover and staff issues are minimized. It builds capacity for leadership at all levels and increases the likelihood of pervasive diffusion. And the component of this slide that I'd like to focus on is increases sustainability. It's not a matter of determining that something doesn't work. It's really looking at what's not working and making the appropriate changes across the system based on that data that we've collected. And if we don't have the right data, we can't make the right changes. And that's where we get a lot of frustration across the system when we keep changing the innovations and giving something new instead of building and increasing and improving on what we're currently doing.
All right, so thank you, Kevin. I'm going to take the next few slides here. Good afternoon. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what is cohesive leadership and how do you build that team to make that change happen. Sometimes we walk into, our roles and the team has already been defined for us, right? They say this is who is in your department and these are the policies and practices that are happening. But when you're really looking at changing the way things have been rolling along in the past and really making something new and innovative and based on your vision and mission, you really need that cohesive leadership to find the right people, that really starts in the beginning, who's on board. And I was just at an equity conference where Dr. Steve Perry presented and he shared, kind of a question to the audience, and it was, did you answer the call or did you answer the calling? And so the call being, did you answer the call because you were offered the job, or did you answer the calling because this is the right thing to do for kids? And really looking at that equity and access and getting the right people who answered the calling, and also, of course, answered the call, but really more than that, the calling, to build this cohesive leadership team and move the system forward. And there has to be that creation of trust, really that vulnerability-based trust where you can feel free to share ideas, challenge the status quo, have that healthy conflict, and you can't do that if there isn't trust at the foundation. We'll talk more about that in the next couple slides, as well as setting common goals. So Michael Fullen talks about coherence and leadership, and it's moving beyond just alignment and really setting small and attainable goals. We can have these very, very lofty plans, but it's going to be really, really hard to get there when you have a series of long-range overarching goals that really you can address in the immediate future. So back to you guys, it's your turn there on the chat again. The question is, what characteristics would you be looking for in your leadership team? So if you could come up with, just a couple of characteristics, what are most important on your leadership team? Go ahead and put that in the chat box there, and we'll see what people respond to. Flexibility and commitment, those are huge, right? Flexibility, open to change, yes. Yes, knowledgeable, credible. These are great. Wholehearted, I love that. If you guys know the wholehearted leadership. Yes, growth mindset, good one. So a lot around, commitment and flexibility. We definitely need both of those, right? You have to be flexible and not just stick to the status quo and go through the motions, but thinking outside the box, as Christine White just said, and dedicated to those outcomes and that shared vision, right? So finding the right people, Dr. Andrew Wall over at University of Redlands, he shared this with us. A leader being vocal, visible, and visionary. That was really key. And this, of course, is not the exhaustive list, but just kind of a few key points for us to be thinking about. And Patrick Lencioni talks about being healthy and smart. So really a broad expertise, right? You want people with the knowledge, as folks in the chat box shared as well, knowledgeable people making decisions and not just kind of off the cuff. Representative of all layers of the organization. As Kevin shared, we're not just talking about the superintendent or those in cabinet, but really representation of what's happening boots on the ground, as well as what's happening more in like legislation and policy analysis and creation and things of that nature. What about the teachers who are actually implementing innovations and change, down to the students? How is this impacting students? Everything we do, every decision we make, has an impact on our kids. And so we need to know, is that working? We talk a lot about compliance doesn't equal equity. And so our paperwork may look good, our meetings look great, we have wonderful action plans, but how is that translating to the impact on the students? And so we need to ask them and families as well to find out. We need folks who are highly credible. I think Bill Bailey mentioned that as well in the chat box. Credibility is huge, and integrity, right? Mean what you say, follow through. Whoever you're talking in front of, that it doesn't change. Having a strong position power, we need those decision makers for sure in our leadership, absolutely. And leveraging that power, right? Not to go against, but to go for, and really promoting that vision and that mission with kids at the center, and being committed, as many of you mentioned in the chat box, committed and dedicated and staying the course and not wavering when it gets tough. It will get tough. We're not saying that this or any systems change is easy. It's heavy lifting, but staying the course because we know it's what's right for kids. And that's what we owe to our students and our families. So we mentioned Patrick Lencioni, and he talks about these characteristics in his book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And really starting, as we mentioned, with trust within the team, being the foundation of everything. And the opposition to that is the fear of being vulnerable, right? If we can't be vulnerable, we're never going to move forward. But we have to have trust within that team, as we mentioned, to share ideas, challenge the status quo, have healthy conflict. And we have to have that healthy conflict. If we go into meetings and we think, oh, everything's great, we're a wonderful, wonderful organization, is that true, or are we just trying to put on a happy front? Are we really going to dig deep and see what we're all about? And does our mission and vision really match our policies and our practices? Is our culture, are we a culture of inclusion, or a culture of inclusion only for our students with mild, moderate disabilities, but really not an inclusive culture for our students with more moderate, severe? Are we talking the walk and walking the talk? But again, really starting with trust. We know that turnover is inevitable, but culture matters on these teams. And research shows that people stay within an organization even through the tough times because of the leadership and because of the culture that's been created. So we have to have our trust within teams. Silos are inevitable, and we want to break down those silos, whether that's between general ed and special ed being on opposite sides of the table, or if those are silos, with our students in our classrooms and how we have, our self-contained classrooms on sort of the back 40. We have silos that we've created. We talk about, self-imposed barriers, but we really need to break those down, release our egos. There is a lot of, let me go back to this quote by a researcher from Columbia University who says, it's critical that network participants feel comfortable being vulnerable and sharing their practices, outcomes, and even frustrations, and that they value and respond to the feedback they receive from other network members. So we really need to be vulnerable, leave our egos at the door, and not be afraid, right? To go into this trusting and in partnership together with, again, students at the forefront. And we talk about, if we can't get our staff together, we can't get our students together. So really having this trust and letting go of our fear and our egos and being able to rely on one another to move the system forward. So having the trust within teams and again, really letting go of the ego, getting rid of the divisions and uniting people where they can be vulnerable. Here's some resources that may help your team. So you have the 5 dysfunctions, as we mentioned with Patrick Lencioni, as well as some different exercises from his organization called the Table Group. So those are there on the slide for you. So again, we talked about finding the right people and creating trust, and having those common goals that are cohesive will appeal to both the head and the heart. And if you know anything about the Heath brothers, Dan and Chip Heath, they wrote a book called Switch. And they use the analogy of the rider and the elephant. And the rider is really the rational person trying to guide this very lofty, emotional, elephant down the path. And you really need to appeal to both the rational side and the emotional side of people to create that change and make it happen. You've got your folks who are going to say, you need to show me the data, and I'll believe it when I see it. And then you've got the folks who say, I just believe in this because it's for kids and I'm on board no matter what it means. So really you need to appeal to kind of both aspects to make that change happen. And having those common goals, it can't just be the superintendent's idea or plan, or it can't just be the director of special ed's plan. Really need to set these goals together and have buy-in built around trust and a commitment to go forward. Otherwise that fidelity piece will never happen. So this slide really, talks about kind of those steps and the functions of a leadership team. And we'll talk more about the rest of these in more detail in subsequent webinars, but we wanted you to have a sense of kind of where we're headed with this slide. So again, beginning with that clear vision. And our team talks a lot about creating a sense of urgency. We love the term, go slow to go fast, but at the same time, if we go too slow, then we're not moving at all. And so we do need to have this sense of urgency, because as we're taking time to create teams and come up with a vision and a mission, our students are getting older, right? And they're moving on. So we owe it to them to really get our ducks in a row and commit to that as being a priority. We have a lot of things on our plates, but really making inclusion and doing things differently a priority for our students. So there has to be a sense of urgency around that, and building that support and network of resources in order to then build capacity and a collective capacity really to move the system forward. As we talked about, leadership changes. And so if you have a culture and you've built capacity, then whoever's in the hot seat or the driver's seat, that culture and that capacity is already there as a foundation for the continued movement. Having a strategic plan, a very intentionally designed plan based on data, to where you can track whether this is successful or not. As Kevin mentioned, if you're going to adopt this, abandon it, as you're reviewing through continuous improvement, and really celebrating those short-term wins. And that bilateral communication at the bottom is critical. Everybody needs to be clear around the purpose, the goal, the expectations, the vision, where we're headed, and how we're going to measure whether that's successful or not. And that takes obviously multiple sets of data. Not just a thumbs up, it's working, but really digging deeply in that data. So another question for you guys in the chat box there. If you're considering joining an organization, which of the 3 phrases below describing that organization would most likely entice you to do so? So kind of what inspires you? Would that be A, engaging in routine and repetitive work? B, it being all about growth and innovation? C, transforming the lives of people to achieve their goals? Or D, to create tools to help you clean? What motivates you? What inspires you in your work? We're seeing lots of C's. There's no right or wrong. B or C, excellent. All right, primarily B and C, 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 yep. Thank you all. So we're, all about growth and innovation and transforming the lives of people to achieve their goals. Very well said. So if you guys don't know the work of Simon Sinek, we really encourage you guys to check him out, because the vision is really the all-important, why. So the picture of the future with implicit or explicit commentary on why people should strive to create that future. So we know what we do in our jobs, and we often know how we do it, whether that's through policies and practices and procedures, but it really comes down to the why. What is your vision? And is the why down to the student level? But really checking why are we an organization that's practicing and what we're practicing? It's really the rally cry, the inspiration, and it's the heart factor of what we do, the purpose behind our work. So here are some examples of that vision or that why and what's at the heart. And I think these three are fantastic. Sima put these together for us, and they're just really descriptive. So Amazon says that their vision is to be Earth's most customer-centric company, where customers can find and discover anything they might want to buy online. TED says that we believe passionately in the power of ideas to change attitudes, lives, and ultimately the world. And finally, Habitat for Humanity says a world where everyone has a decent place to live. Now tell me those are not inspiring vision statements of where those organizations want to be, right? And really shooting for the stars, but very specific statements. And it's really important not just to have a vision statement that sounds good or that's approved by the board and you can post on your website, but really to live by that and strive for that in all the work that you do. So most organizations focus on a mission in comparison to a vision, but it's important because it's a clear communication to the staff and to those at large regarding what the company does. So you really are looking at declaring an organization's present purpose. What are we doing right now? How do we do it? Who do we do it for? And what value are we bringing? So this is our mission. This is right now what we're doing. Whereas our vision is more of where we want to be and how we want to communicate that, that purpose in our work and the why behind what we do. So here, values, we're looking at those being the guiding principles of the organization, what we stand by and what we practice. And those values should really be the guiding factors of our decisions, every decision we make, our behavior. And it's more than just our belief, right? It's what our choices are. So like we talked about, we're walking the talk. If you say that you're a great school for all kids, are you? Is that really what your decisions and your behaviors show? Because if you say that you value all kids to learn at high levels, then that should be replicated or seen in your actions and your behaviors. So ultimately, values determine culture, culture determines behavior, and behavior determines our outcomes, right? So here's a great example. This is actually one of my favorite examples of Southwest. If you guys are familiar, we fly them all the time as we're going up and down the state, working with our districts. So here's a sample of Southwest's vision, mission, and values for you to consider. So their vision is to become the world's most loved, most flown, most profitable airline. That's where they strive to be, right? That's their inspiration, that's their heart, that's their motivating factor, their why. Their mission is that they're dedicated to the highest quality of customer service, delivered with a sense of warmth, friendliness, individual pride, and company spirit. But their values that really guide their company is living the Southwest way and working the Southwest way. So you can see how these inspirations are coming up with the warrior spirit, the servant heart, the fun-loving attitude, and of course, always having safety, reliability, customer service, and low cost at the heart of that. But you can see that in their behaviors. If you've ever flown and the Southwest folks, the flight attendants are singing on the plane, or they're offering you donuts as you walk down the jetway, they really are looking to be a servant leader company and being very fun-loving. I heard a story or read a story about how they do their hiring practices and having folks come in and then ask them, as they're in their suits and ties, to go in the next room and change into these khaki pants or khaki shorts and come back in. And that's kind of their first test of, are they fun loving? Are they willing to do that? Or are they so stiff and they're going to stick in their suits and ties to get through this interview? And they'll often use that as kind of a checkpoint of, is this going to be the warrior spirit, the fun loving attitude that we need in our company? So they're definitely practicing that and valuing that, walking the talk.
All right. Thank you, Kristen and Kevin. So this is where I jump in. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. All right. So I am Dr. Sima Cuddy, and I am going to start you off by asking you a question. Okay, lots of questions in this webinar. We take feedback seriously. So consider that you're going to buy a car, right? You're going to buy a car, and obviously it's going to be a big investment of your money, but also time and resources if you don't make the right choice, right? So what would make it easier for you to commit to buying a car? A, that you have all or adequate information about the car, or B, that you actually don't have any information at all about the car. So go ahead and say A or B. A, adequate information. B, no information. And as expected, I know that most of you will say A. People are not going to invest a huge amount of their time, their effort, and their resources when you don't have enough information. But the point I'm trying to make over here is that if we are not ready to make a change that we actually are considering making without adequate information, then how do we expect people to follow through with us if they don't have all the information? So information leads to the building of clarity, and clarity is what gives us the confidence to buy into a cause and commit to it and stay the course, right? So let's kind of recap what we have learned all through this presentation. We talked about cohesive leadership teams that are built on trust and that are going to define vision, mission, and values. Now that is really important to do because, as Kristen mentioned earlier, it changes what you do from just accepting a call to being your calling, right? If you can inspire people and you can define very clearly what it is that you're asking them to do, then you are creating clarity. But clarity does not just generate from putting things down on a piece of paper. Clarity is very closely connected with culture, right? And so culture is actually built by engaging in a series of practices. Now, the onus of engaging in these practices is really on the leadership team. So here are a few practices that leaders can engage in, thereby building culture and thereby increasing clarity. So the first one is obvious, right? Leaders walking the talk. Now, Kristen and Kevin have alluded to this. If you are advocating increasing inclusion, but in every IEP, you are not actually integrating kids, you're segregating kids, then that's sending actually a very clear message, but it's the wrong message, right? It's probably not the message that you want to send. So you have to be really, really clear about what you are advocating for and what behaviors you're putting out there that people are going to observe. Building capacities is very important. Now, consider that you are a child who's just starting to learn his letters. You cannot expect a child who's just learning his letters to go from reading his letters to reading full text the next day. You have to give people time to build their capacities. You have to expose them through knowledge, expose them to knowledge through, professional development, forums, any way that you consider appropriate for your context and situation, so that they're able to actually understand the information and move in the direction that you want them to move to. Now, while they're doing that, as a leadership team, it is also important, very important, to create conditions that enable trust and collaboration. So when you start out on a change, there'll be those first few followers who follow you, correct? And it is very risky to be the first follower because you're actually departing from the norm. And when you're departing from the norm, you're isolating yourself. So it's very important as a leader to support those first few followers. Say a person wants to implement an inclusive practice. It is important that you support them as long as it is aligned with your mission, vision, and values, and it is evidence-based. Support them. Even if they fail, take that failure, turn it around into lessons learned, and use it to refine and walk and move towards your goals. Because that creates a culture of transparency and sharing and support and trust that others who are right on that edge, the precipice of change, like they're debating whether I should jump in or I should not, they will then be much more inclined to take the leap rather than stay where they are in their comfort zone. And the last one is really about communication systems. We've alluded to this before. Now, I worked in organizations where I've led change in big change. And I think this is one of the most important personal lessons that I learned, is that if you believe that putting a message out there, even among a select group, or a group that you're much wider than you're used to, if that is going to communicate that message to all different levels of the organization, that is wrong. You actually have to build structures, channels, where you can be ensured that that communication is going to disseminate in the same way, in the same tone that you want, with the same mindset that you have, to all different levels of the organization. So Lencioni talks about not only communicating clarity, but over-communicating clarity. So it's only when you engage people, when you discuss what you are advocating, even if it is someone who's questioning you, where you are able to answer their questions with data, and you are able to hold forums, whatever works. But talking the walk and developing a common language that your entire organization can then use to talk about the topic, that encourages clarity to be developed. Okay? All right. So here's where we are. We talked about leadership team, creating vision, mission, and values, creating clarity and culture being fostered and built from there, and then communicating that clarity forward, right? What we are doing by doing all of this is building a shared purpose. So imagine an organization where you are all engaged in these discussions. This is the biggest thing. You have used multiple channels of communication. You're seeking feedback from all the stakeholders, and using that feedback, you're refining and kind of molding your purpose. By doing so, you are then creating urgency of purpose. Urgency of purpose really means that your organization now clearly understands what is it that you're advocating for. Why are you advocating, most importantly? So what do they stand to gain from it? And what are the consequences for this organization if they don't move forward on that path? So that is urgency of purpose. Any questions about that? No? Okay, so urgency of purpose is really important for the singular reason that change is very difficult, okay? For most of us, change is very difficult. We are all like this really, really content goldfish who's content to be in his comfortable goldfish bowl, right? You don't want to move from there. Inertia is very difficult to overcome. And that is because we always have a fear. We have a fear of the unknown, which is why clarity is so important, right? Questions, whenever change comes about, the questions that always are asked is, what is there for me in this? Will I have to work more? Will there be a loss of power? Will there be a loss of position? So that fear is inherent in all of us, and that is why change is so difficult. But when you put out information out there, then you enable clarity to be built, and you enable people to get the answers. Most people will choose to do things the same way and will remain the way they are unless somebody actually shows them through data, through communication, through discussions, how to do it differently or even better, right? And so if you don't communicate what you're trying to achieve by clearly showing people, look, here's where we are, this is wrong, this is why it is wrong, and this is why it is important for us to change, and the time to do it is now, that is creating urgency of purpose. Okay? So kind of bringing it all back together, creating urgency of purpose is really important because it prevents complacency. It forces you to dig deep, to use all the information you have, to use data, and to prove to people that it is okay and it is actually beneficial for them to make that leap from their current state to the future state. But more so, it also provides a stage where everybody is on the same page. If you educate people and if you empower them with information, they're all united in exactly where they want to go. There is no ambiguity about it, right? So they know I'm here and this is where I want to go. And not only a small team, but the entire organization is on the same page. So tomorrow, if some key leaders drop off, that doesn't matter. Why? Because one, you've created clarity so everybody knows where to go. And secondly, they know the urgency of doing so. They know what they stand to gain or lose by doing so. That is important. And urgency of purpose, the biggest thing is urgency of purpose enables you to get a critical mass of supporters behind your change movement. Now that critical mass is really, really important. So there is a theory in change management, and I guess if I'll encourage people to see if you know it, but basically the theory talks about for any new idea or change to be successful, that means for it to be accepted by the widespread majority, you need a critical mass of support behind it, okay? Does anyone know which theory I'm talking about? It's Everett Rogers. If you want, you can type it into the chat box. Any takers? Everett Rogers. Someone behind the scenes is going to Google and say, yes, I know it. And that's fine, go ahead. But without taking too much time, no takers? Okay, so it's Everett Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovation. So basically what he said is for any innovation, any new idea to be accepted by the masses, for anything to be accepted into a general population, no matter what the context is, then you need a critical mass of people supporting it. Now take Facebook, right? It started as a very, very small group of university students just using it to chat among themselves. But it was not until it got support from influencers and early adopters that it actually blew up and spread out to become the massive phenomenon that it is today. All right, so to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you a video. Do we have the time? I think so, right. Okay, so I'm going to toggle a little bit, bear with me, but this video is a really funny but insightful look at how movements are started. Now it's very famous, it's a famous TED Talk, so most of you might be familiar with it, and it's a little jumpy at the start, but bear with me as I get it started. All right, so here we go.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. Here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
All right. Uh-oh. Where is... All right, so starting a movement share. Okay, do you see, are we back to the PowerPoint? Yes, okay, good. All right, so I hope that helped you understand the importance of starting a movement and what roles leaders and followers play. It's really important to get that first critical mass of followers that'll just snowball your movement into success. So don't be like this guy who's trying to do all the work alone and trying to push that big boulder up that big mountain. That's going to be hard. It's really not going to, you're probably not going to succeed. What you want to do is you want to create a movement and you want to get that critical mass of followers, which is why urgency of purpose is so important. See, once you get this critical mass of followers who buy into what you want them to do, it becomes really easy. They're doing it with ties and with dress shoes. So it's really easy. See, that's the point. All right, so let's connect all the dots as we come to the close of this. You have your cohesive leadership team. Take the time to develop clear vision, mission, and values that inspire, inform, and guide people. Communicate that out. Communicate it out to create clarity and to develop urgency of purpose. Let that shared purpose diffuse your organization so that everybody is on the same page. They understand what we are about. They understand what your cause is about, why is it so important, and that the time to act is now. And if you are able to do that, and you are going to get the support of those early adopters who will just magnify and amplify the success of your change. All right, so that is bringing it all together, and that is what envisioning is all about. So really wanted to emphasize that this is a really critical step. As Kevin said, most organizations jump into change without actually thinking through these steps and taking the time to, implement these steps. But these steps can make all the difference between success, sustainability, or failure, right? So that was envisioning. We do want to discuss what is next. On November 6th, we will be having our next webinar series, which will be going into the building segment of our blueprint. And we'll be looking at data collection, root cause analysis, really developing a good strategy and policy and practice. Really excited about the events. So we have a series of 4 webinars that Katie Nowak will be presenting on UDL. Very excited, and we will share dates in our next slide. But also we are going to hold an SFSU led workshop, so San Francisco State University led workshop, and it's going to be a really practical workshop that is focused on early childhood. So really encourage all of you to attend. We'll be sending out flyers and information regarding that. Just a quick reminder to the exemplars. One of the asks that we had last time around in our last webinar was for you to schedule quarterly meeting dates with your assigned LEAs. So if you have those dates, please send me the schedule of those dates as soon as possible. If you have any questions, please email me directly. And of course, we value your feedback. We put a lot of effort and time to distill a lot of information from different sources to compile these webinars. So we appreciate any information, any feedback that you can give us. So here are the list of SIP events. Of course, we will be posting this to our Padlet, the recorded version, so you can note down the dates. I'll pause a little bit over there. And of course, there's the survey. We do have a lot of references and videos also with this presentation, with this webinar, so feel free to peruse them when you have time. But thank you, it's been delightful holding this webinar for you. Thank you so much for your participation. We appreciate everything that you do across your LEAs. Thanks so much.